churches all over the country and the world, and I'm always feel enriched by that afterward. And it's always a part of that church is God puts in my heart afterwards. So I always like to hear the updates, and I hope that your pastor will keep us informed of the great work that God does here in the days to come, because it appears to me that God has everything in place to do a great work here in the days to come. And so you're most fortunate to be in a church that preaches the word and prays and loves one another. And I'm excited about what God's going to do for you, and appreciate just your willingness to hear from the word and to grow. And I just appreciate so many already that I've talked to that have just told me how God's been working in their life, and even just in the last 2 days to just take them a little bit closer. And that's always so encouraging when I hear that. Well, one of the things I learned just with my dad is a great man of God, and he has been used by God in mighty ways. And I watched his life, and then I watched my own life, and just to see how God grows people. And I've always been fascinated how some people will grow so deep in their walk with God. And when they pray, you just know that's not an ordinary prayer. That person is praying like I don't hear prayers very often. And I see some people with faith in God that can move mountains, and you just think, how did that person ever get to believe and trust God that much, where it just seems that he sees miracles taking place all the time? And some people are just so loving, and you just feel like that is the love of Jesus right before my eyes. And they don't call a lot of attention to themselves, but they just have a way of loving people in a way that a lot of us would never even think to. And I just watch as God just takes us from where we are, and he just keeps growing us to where he wants us to be. And over the course of my life, I think I mentioned on Sunday morning, in my life, I've not just grown the same amount every day and every week. There's been weeks where I didn't grow at all, sadly. I was going to church. I just wasn't any better of a Christian because I'd gone to church. And I'd read my Bible, and I confess to you that there's been months, maybe even years, where I was basically the same Christian when I started the year and when I ended the year. I'd been to church a lot. I knew maybe a few more things about the Bible, but my Christianity, my walk with God, was basically the same. And then now and then, God would get my attention. And he'd get my attention, and I would have a breakthrough like I talked about Sunday morning. And all of a sudden, I'd begin growing. And sometimes that was from really good experiences, like there'd be a revival meeting, and a preacher might come in and say some things I just had not considered before, and God would get a hold of me, and I would just take off. And sometimes it was through difficult times, where I'd go through a crisis in my life, and it would drive me to my knees, and I would say, God, just make me a better man. But whether it was good times or bad times, just periodically in my life, God would suddenly get me in the growth track, and I'd start growing. And I could probably count in my life 6 or 7 major times in my life where a lot of my growth took place. You know, you take out those 6 or 7 times in my life, and that may constitute the bulk of my growth as a Christian. And just now and then, I suspect most of you, if I were just to hone in on your Christian growth, there's probably 5 or 6, 7 periods in your life where you did a lot of your growing. Well, the last time that I really had one of those growth spurts was about 4 years ago. I gratefully that I don't have to look back decades ago. About 4 years ago was the last time I really had a life-changing experience. And I've alluded to it with some of you already, but it was 4 years ago that I became a grandparent. And now, I know there's some grandparents here, and I've been told that being a grandparent was a good thing, that people talked about it being great, but frankly, I thought it was overstated. I thought people were exaggerating. Now, I knew it would be good, but but I've done a lot of great things in my life, and so I just thought it would be another good thing. But I mean, I've had lots of experiences in my life, and not only that, but I've been around some really obnoxious grandparents. Do you know those kind of people? Like I'd be on an airplane, and they would find a way I'd sit next to a total stranger, and they would find a way in every conversation to bring it around to their grandchildren. You could be talking about world hunger, and it would remind them of one of their grandchildren. And then they would pull out 38 pictures of their 6-year-old grandson's 6-year-old birthday party, and they'd bore you to tears. And so I just said, I'm just not going to become that boring grandparent that just bores people going on and on and on about how wonderful my grandkids are. But what happened to me made it a little bit unusual was that 4 years ago, I didn't have any grandkids. I was grandchildless. And then in 15 days, I had 3 grandsons. So I went from 0 to 3 in 15 days. I just believe go big or go home. And so my younger son had twins, and then 15 days later, my older son had a boy too, and so 3 boys, 15 days. And now since then I've had another one, and I've got actually 2 more due in the new year. So, but those first 3, when they came, I don't know what happened to me, because I remember it was a Saturday morning, and I'd been gone weekend after weekend at speaking and traveling. But this weekend I was actually home, and I'll tell you, for me, when I can wake up in my own bed on a Saturday morning and know I've got all day Saturday to take care of stuff, that's just awesome. And so it's my first Saturday at home for a while. I'm lying there in bed thinking, I'm enjoying just being in my own bed. I'm going to get some coffee in a moment. I'm going to get up, and I've got a lot of chores I want to get done today. And all of a sudden the phone rings. It's my son Daniel. He said, Dad, the twins, they're on their way. We're headed to the hospital right now. Mom and you need to meet us there as soon as you can. And I don't know what happened to me. So I'm a relatively intelligent person. I have a PhD. But one phone call, and I became an idiot. It's like I just couldn't think. I lost all my brain functioning power. I just jumped out of bed. I said, Lisa, the twins are coming. We've got to get to the hospital. And we ran out into the car in the garage. We're not even completely dressed yet. And we're like running into the car in the garage. I said, wait a minute, I don't have my keys. Wait right here. I ran back in the house, got my car keys, ran back out into the car, and I don't have my wallet. Wait right here. It took me 3 trips back in the house before I had enough supplies to pull out of the driveway. We're backing out of the driveway, and I look, and there's no gas in the car. It's right on fumes. And I'd planned, one of my chores that day was to gas up the car, but I hadn't gotten going yet. And so I said, Lisa, we will never make it to the hospital. We've got to stop, get gas. She said, well, why did you let it get so low? Why didn't you fill it up ahead of time? I said, Lisa, those babies are 2 weeks early. Today is ahead of time. I was going to do it today. And I said, I'll just put in $5 worth. That's all. And so first gas station we saw, I swerved in, jumped out, ran to put in just a little bit of gas, and they've got one of those covers over the nozzle. That one's out of gas. So I jump back in the car, drive up to another nozzle, frantically trying to put in the gas. We race out of there, and we're driving along toward the hospital. I said, Lisa, don't get upset, but we left the house so fast, I didn't have any coffee this morning. Haven't had breakfast yet. This could take a while. Sometimes babies they don't decide to come out right away, and we'll be there at the hospital with nothing to eat or drink, and I don't really want those beautiful grandchildren, their first sight of me without having had any coffee yet. It'll terrify those innocent little babies. They'll climb right back in the womb and say, we're not going to come out there if human beings look like that on the outside. I said, there's a McDonald's up there. I said, we'll just swing by. I'll just get a coffee to go and maybe an oatmeal to hold me over. I said, I won't even come to a complete stop. I'll just drive slowly by the drive-thru. 2 oatmeals, 2 coffees to go. Make it fast. We're having a baby. And so we swing by. I made the order, and the person actually said, well, would you just pull over into the pickup area there? We'll have to bring that out to you. I won't even tell you what my beloved wife is muttering to me at that point. She's anxious for us to get there. As soon as they carry out our breakfast, we grab it and we squeal out of that McDonald's parking lot. We're racing over to where the hospital is. Now, I've never been to this hospital before, but I know generally where it is. It's not in a part of town I go to often, but we're driving along. Sure enough, I could see the big H for hospital above this building, and so I'm pulling into that exit. And my wife, at this point, is frantic. She says, Richard, we're so late now. Just
don't even park the car. Just drop me off at the front door. She said, those children will be in kindergarten before I see them at this point. And so I drop her off at the front door. She goes running in. Now I'm trying to find, where do you park? I'm not sure where the long-term parking is here. I'm looking around. And all of a sudden, a moment later, I see in my rearview mirror my wife running out of the hospital. She's flagging me down like this. And so I pulled around, rolled down my window. She said, this is the wrong hospital. Like, we literally went to the wrong hospital. I mean, I don't know what happened to me. I don't know what I was thinking. And so we jump. It's an affiliate of the Wright Hospital. The Wright Hospital is about 1.5 miles further down the road. This is an affiliate, but they don't do babies in this one. So we're racing down another 1.5 miles. At this point, I race in. I said, Lisa, I'm not going to drop you off early. Those are my grandkids, too. You shouldn't have an unfair advantage on me getting to those babies. So we just parked the car, ran in the hospital, went up to the maternity ward. I ran up to the nurse at the desk. I said, I'm Richard Blackaby. I'm the grandfather. Where do you need me? I assumed they'd want to get me gowned up and gloved up and have me in some strategic positioning, maybe consult with me about what was going to be happening. They said, we'd like you right back over there. They pointed to a little waiting room. A little cubbyhole waiting room. I discovered later that there's a much larger waiting area where the normal people wait, but they could tell I was going to be trouble, so they put me in the back little corner cubby. I was the only person in there. Even my wife didn't want to go in there. She thought, why go in there when there's a perfectly good gift shop just one floor below? So she goes to buy gifts, and so I'm in there by myself, and there's a TV up on the wall, and it's 24-hour news. And of course, if you watch 24-hour news, you know what I'm seeing. There's just been a suicide bomber at a wedding, killing 24 innocent wedding attenders. There's been a shooting, another double homicide. There's been racial tension. There's been another scandal. And just story after story after story. Every story is negative, discouraging, depressing. And at a certain point, it dawns on me, that is the world that my 2 grandsons are entering today. And so I've got such mixed feelings. I'm so excited about these new little boys, but heavy-hearted to know what kind of world they'll have to navigate their life through. Well, eventually, word comes out. One of the babies is now in my daughter-in-law's hospital room. One is still being tended in the nursery, but there is one available for handling now. And so we're allowed, my son finally allowed, he wouldn't let us in at first. He knew I think he wasn't sure we'd behave ourselves, but he finally said, okay, you can come back. One of the babies is in here. So we make our way back. And you have to understand, I'm very good to my wife. I take care of her. I wait on her. I serve her. I bring her coffee in the mornings. I do all kinds of nice things for her. But there was only one baby, and there was 2 grandparents. And I have played a lot of sports where there was only one ball, and there was more than one person that wanted that ball. And so I've learned that if there's 2 people going for the same ball, if you step in front of that person, you can get to that ball before they do. And so I just sort of like, oh, there's the baby. I stepped in front of my wife, made my way. Then my wife falls into a bedpan. I'm making a run for that. I ended up shamelessly holding our 3 grandsons first after their parents. I was the first person after the parents, and I grabbed that child, first baby to make me a grandfather, and I'm holding up this brand new baby, looking into his face. And those of you that have ever done that, and you look into the face of a brand new baby and you think, you wish you could see the future. You wish you knew what this child would become. When will this child know that I'm his favorite human being? And when will he get married? Will he be a godly young adult? Well, when will he come to give his heart to you, Lord? All these questions. And as I'm holding this little baby, I'm reminded of all the stuff that I'd seen on that news channel. And it dawns on me that there'll be a day when pornography will come spewing through the airwaves, trying to corrupt and destroy this little boy's innocent heart and mind. And there'll be a day, perhaps at school, when a teacher or a professor will laugh and mock the very thought that there's a creator who created the universe. And a day may come when his own friends are laughing at him because he's not doing the same things everybody else is doing. And as I'm thinking about all that lies ahead of this little boy, God just quietly said to me, and what kind of grandparent will this boy need? So when the world comes to just pull him away into the darkness, what kind of grandparent, what kind of grandfatherly influence will hold him in place and help him keep trusting in God? So when that professor says, there is no God, will that grandson say, but I've heard my grandfather talk to God. I know there's a God. When his friends laugh at him because he won't participate in the same activities everyone else is, will that grandson say, but my grandfather's a Christian. And if that's what it means to be a Christian, then I want to be one too. And God is a God of truth and grace. And in truth, God just said, Richard, you're not yet the man this grandson's going to need you to be. But then in grace, he said, but you can be. You can be, if you're willing. And I'll tell you what, I just made a commitment right then that I would be all, and you know, it's different. Some of you that are grandparents understand this. You know, my three kids turned out okay. They've all gone to seminary. They're all actually in ministry today or headed that way. But being a grandparent's different, because when you're a parent, you have a lot of control. You have a lot of power. You tell them, go to your room. You know, you're not getting dessert. You're going to get punished. But grandparents don't necessarily have that kind of power. I can't really tell my grandkids to do anything. And so the influence you have as a grandparent is when you tell your grandchild what you think they should do, they look you in the eye and decide if they value your opinion enough to do what you just said. It's an influence of who you are. It's an influence of what they see in who you are. Do they love you enough to want to do what you say? Do they respect you enough? And God just said, you're going to have to take your leadership, your influence to a whole nother level if you're going to have success with your grandkids like you had with your kids. And so I just began to say, then, God, take me there. Grow up. Now, I had actually a picture of those three boys I wanted to show you on the PowerPoint, but we're having trouble tonight. So I'm... but sadly, they're not nearly as cute as mine. So... I think I do have a picture in my Bible I could show. I'm sorry, I wanted to flip up right there and show you the day that 15 days later I brought the twins in and set them in the bed next to their brand new cousin that had been born that day. And I keep a picture of those grandsons in my Bible. So every day when my alarm goes off early in the morning, it's time to get up and meet with God. And my body says, oh, I'm just too tired. Maybe I should just skip today. I think of those grandboys. God says, well, if you won't grow in your walk with God for your own sake, will you get up in the morning and grow for their sake? Well, if you wouldn't become a greater man of prayer for your own sake, don't you want to be a greater prayer warrior for those three boys? And every time I look at their picture, it just motivates me to say, I'll do it for them. I'll do it for them. Because when they go out into the world, you know, I have a lot of people that will say to me, well, I'm just not all that good at praying. I had a young men will say that more than women. I had a young man come to me one time. He said, well, Richard, my wife is the prayer in our home. My wife's the one who does the praying in our home. I've had a number of men tell me that, but this young man said that. And I don't know, it just struck me the wrong way. And so I said, well, are you telling me that your wife, every day your wife prays for you? Yeah, every day. And what does she pray for? Well, she prays for God to protect me, that he'll bless me, that he'll give me wisdom, he'll keep me safe. Prays every day. I'm a fortunate man. So I said, so you're telling me every day your wife prays that you'll be safe, you'll be blessed, that you'll have wisdom, you'll have the power of God in your life. He said, that's right. I said, and so who prays for her? I said, so you go through life being prayed for every day, but your wife doesn't. And I said, do you look your wife in the eye and say, I'm sorry that you're going through your day without being prayed for, but I've just never been all that good at prayer. I said, you know what? There's a simple solution to that. Get good at prayer. It's not rocket science. I said, anybody can pray who really wants to. If you're not good at prayer, you just don't care enough to become good at prayer. That's the bottom line. And I'll just tell you, I got kind of lazy in my prayer life at times. So I saw those grandsons. And then I thought, in fact, I'll chase a rabbit just for a moment, but Rick's wife is a great prayer warrior, and I got a great idea from her. And what I took this idea just straight from her, but what I did is I went out and I got 3 really nice hardcover journals. And I've got a journal for each of my grandsons. Now I've got 6 of them. And every time I pray something for them, I write that prayer in the journal. And I've got pictures of them and observations of them. When one of the twins looks out, one day one of the twins was crying. And I just noticed they were in strollers at the time, double strollers. One was crying and upset. And I saw the other twin just put his hand over on his brother's hand, just comforting him. I just noticed that. I went back and I wrote that in the journal. I said today, when Logan was crying, I said, I saw Emerson just reach out and comfort his brother. I said, he's only a year and a half, and he's already encouraging hurting people. I said, God, I just pray you always give him a tender heart. So even when he's 50, he's the guy that you know, if you're hurting, you want to call on him. If you're in the hospital, you want him to come by because he just cares. God, I've seen it at 1.5. Would you just grow that in him until he just is used by you all over the place just to bring comfort and the peace of God. And so every time I see something in one of them, I go and write it in their prayer journal. And one day, I wish I'd thought to do that. I didn't know Rick's wife when I was raising my own kids, or I would have done it for my kids. But one day, maybe when they're 18, I want to just give them their journals. Whenever I die, or at some point, when it still will make meaningful to them, I want them to see what in fact, I started praying for all of them before they were ever born. And what I even prayed before I knew them and met them. And I've got them all sitting on my desk. And every day when I pray for them, I just pull it out and I actually write the prayer. So one day they'll know what their grandfather prayed for them. And I'm just saying, God, take my prayer life to a whole nother level. And I want you just to see, there's a wonderful passage I wanted to look at for a few moments here tonight that talks about this. It talks about why you have to keep growing, why you can't ever just stop where you are. And it's found in Matthew chapter 17. And I want just to unpack a couple of verses. And you know that the context of this story is that Jesus is preparing to go to the cross. And so his father summons him up onto the Mount of Transfiguration. He's going to have a very glorious special meeting with his son, preparing him for the cross. And so Jesus takes Peter, James, and John with him up on that mountain. But he leaves the other 9 behind. Now, there's some speculation about which mountain was the Mount of Transfiguration. They kind of narrowed it down to perhaps 2 or 3 mountains. And all of those mountains could accommodate 12 men on them. So Jesus could have taken all 12 disciples with him if he had chosen to. But he only takes 3. I've often thought, God, if you've got a deep, profound work you want to do, I hope that I'm walking with you in such a way I don't get left behind. I pray that if you're going to do a great work, God, I want to make sure I'm ready so that you would entrust me to go with you. He takes 3 and he sends 9. Now, I don't know if the 9 were being punished, but what he says is go into the village and minister to the village. So 3, he says, Peter, James, and John, we're going to go up on the mountain and meet Moses and Elijah and talk to God the Father. You guys go on in and see if you can't help some people out in that village over there. And we know the disciples enough to know they were always comparing each other. They were always competing about who had the right hand, the left hand, who was going to be the greatest. They always argued about that. So we know that it probably bothered them, the 9 that didn't get taken up on the mountain. But those 9 go into the village, and they're ministering. And if you go back to Matthew chapter 10, it tells us that Jesus gave them all power and authority to cast out demons, to heal the sick, to preach the kingdom of God. So they've all been given power, and they all went out, and it says that the implication is that all 12 disciples had been effective. They'd all had success in ministry. And they all came back, and now 9 are being sent out again. So they go into the village, they're ministering to various people, and then all of a sudden, apparently a father comes running up to them. And this father had an only child. The Gospel of Luke says it was his only child, but it's a little boy. And this boy has an evil spirit. And periodically, this evil spirit will come upon the boy, and he'll have seizures, and he'll fall to the ground. And if he's near the fire, he may fall right into the burning coals. If he's near water, he could fall right into the water and be drowned. So this man lives in fear all the time. If he wakes up in the middle of the night and he hears a noise, he's going to panic. Is that my son? Has he fallen into the fire? Where is he? And any noise in the night, any time he doesn't see his son and he hears a strange noise, he has to wonder, what's happened? And he's gone to every doctor. He's tried every cure that people have suggested. Nothing has worked. Then one day he hears from a friend, those disciples of Jesus, that miracle worker. There's 9 of his disciples in our village. They've set all kinds of people free. They've done all kinds of miracles. And so this father bundles up his little son and he runs through the village until he finds the 9 disciples. And he begs them to set his boy free. But they can't. They fail. And so just about that time, Jesus has now come down from the mountain. He's coming into the village to collect his other 9 disciples. And so in verse 14, it says, when they reached the crowd, a man approached and knelt down before him. Lord, he said, have mercy on my son, because he has seizures and suffers terribly. He often falls into the fire and often into the water. I brought him to your disciples, but they couldn't heal him. Jesus replied, you unbelieving and perverse generation, how long will I be with you? How long must I put up with you? Bring him here to me. Then Jesus rebuked the demon, and it came out of him. And from that moment, the boy was healed. Then the disciples approached Jesus privately and said, why couldn't we drive it out? Because of your little faith, he told them. For truly I tell you, if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, you will tell this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move. Nothing will be impossible for you. There's a couple of things that this passage has particularly been speaking to me about of late. And one is that there's a truth that if you haven't learned yet, you will soon. And that is that in life, we will all eventually get to the end of ourselves. We will all get to the end of our abilities and our successes and our strengths. Something will inevitably come into our life that's bigger than us. Some of us, we fall on our face early in life. We face a temptation. We face a job that's too big for us. We face criticism or opposition or hardship, and it crushes us. Some of us, we don't face that for a while. We can go quite a ways. And I've worked with businessmen, businesswomen, who've been very successful in business. And now they run billion-dollar companies. They fly around on corporate jets. It seems like everything they touch turns to gold. Then one day they find that their only daughter is addicted to drugs. And there's nothing they can do to set their daughter free. I know a man running a $5 billion company right now. And his daughter is walking the streets, prostituting herself for her next drug. And there's nothing he can do to help his daughter. He's done everything he knows to do. And nothing has set his daughter free. He'd gladly give up everything to save his daughter, and nothing works. Folks, a time will come in your life. It may be, for each of us, it could be a different thing. It might be a broken relationship. I had that happen to me. I typically get along with people. People typically like me. I've gone through my life basically been liked by people. And then I ran into a relationship that broke. And I did everything that always worked, that always reconciled people. I could get reconciled to some of the hardest, most obnoxious characters, but I could not get reconciled with this person. I don't know what it might be in your life. It might be a financial need. There's so many things that come along our way. For a church, that can happen. Churches can be growing along and doing fine, and at some point it'll hit something that's bigger than it's ever had to face before. And at that point, you have one of two choices. You can either grow so that now your faith and your walk with God is big enough for you to have victory in the situation. Or you can go. You can quit. You can give up. And apparently that's what happened to these disciples. Now they had cast out demons before. They'd had success before. It wasn't like they'd never encountered an evil spirit before. But apparently they'd never handled one like this before. They handled one that was more difficult than they'd ever experienced. And I could only imagine what these disciples did. Maybe this man, the father, perhaps he came up to Thomas first, and he begged Thomas, would you set my boy free? And perhaps Thomas thought to himself, well, last week on a preaching tour in another village, I cast out 2 evil spirits. Yeah, sure, you got a little boy? Shouldn't take much. I set free 2 grown men last week. I can certainly handle a little boy. And Thomas did whatever he did to cast out spirits, but nothing happened. And I could imagine Andrew coming up and saying, Thomas, can't believe you couldn't set a little boy free. I set 3 people free last week. You have too much doubt, Thomas. That's your problem. But let me show you what I do. It always works for me whenever I'm dealing with an evil spirit. And Andrew does what he can do, and nothing happens. Maybe all 9 disciples gave it their best shot. By the way, do you know one thing I've learned? People don't need our best. They need God's best. Those disciples gave it their best. And on that day, they realized their best wasn't enough. I'll tell you what, it's a humbling thing when you realize your best isn't adequate. I've had people say, well, I gave it my best shot. And you want to say, well, then you don't have very good aim because your best shot didn't do a thing. 9 disciples all did their best, and it wasn't enough. And then Jesus comes back. And by the way, do you notice how Jesus speaks when he finds out about what's been going on? Oh, faithless and perverse generation. Does that sound like the Jesus that we are accustomed to? How long must I be with you? How long must I bear with you? What do you think that's about? You know, we don't know. You can't see who Jesus is looking at when he said that. But I've always felt he was at least including his own disciples. Because the Bible says, to whom's been given much, much is required and expected. No one had been given as much as those disciples. At the beginning of chapter 10, Jesus clearly gave every one of those disciples the power and authority to set people free from evil spirits. And now they'd fail. And I'll tell you what, when I read in the Bible and it says, the Father says, I begged your disciples to set my boy free, but they could not. I'll tell you what, I've always been convicted. And I thought, how tragic is it when even God's people give up on someone? See, when God's people give up, there's no more hope. Everybody else can say, this case is impossible. But when God's people say that, what hope is left? How many people would say, I had a troubled teenager that was getting into all kinds of trouble. So we went to your church so my son could be saved from the world that was trying to destroy him. But the other teenagers didn't want anything to do with him. My marriage was in trouble, and we decided we better get back into church, try to do what we can. And we came to church for a month. Nobody even talked to us when we come in the door. So we just quit coming. How many people could be just like this father to say, I went to God's people thinking that there'd be hope there, but they couldn't do anything for me either. This Jesus turns and says, oh, faithless and perverse generation. You see, what happens is, by the way, if I were to go around this room and just say, ask every one of you, how powerful do you think God is? I suspect in this room, most of us would say he's very powerful. I mean, he created the universe. If you can create a star, you're pretty powerful. If you can create a mountain range, create the Grand Canyon, you're pretty powerful. But if I really wanted to know how powerful you believe God was, I wouldn't have to have you show me your statement of faith. I wouldn't have to have you recite a creed to me. I wouldn't have you to tell me about your theology. All I would have to find out is who you've given up on and what you've quit, what you've lost hope for. And I would know how powerful your God was. See, every time you give up on something, you've just said, even God couldn't fix that. When you give up on a broken relationship, you're saying, even God could not mend that relationship. Have you ever been tempted to give up on someone? Maybe you were praying for someone's salvation, and every year, every day you prayed for their salvation. 10 years later, they're not saved yet. So 2019 rolls around, you get out a new prayer journal. Only this year you don't write their name back in to pray for them. You prayed 10 years, nothing happened. You decide to move on. or you had a broken relationship, and you reached out to that person. You invited them for lunch. They didn't ever return your calls. They never answered your emails. You sent letters. They never responded. And so after a while, you just said, it's just hopeless. I guess I'll never be reconciled. Even God doesn't seem to want to reconcile my relationship to that person. Have you given up on somebody? Have you given up on a problem? I've known people that battled with their weight for years, or they battled with a drug issue. They battled with pornography. And they tried. They'd come to the altar and pray, and they would commit. They'd get someone to hold them accountable, but they'd always fall back in to their sinful ways. And after a while, they just felt like such failures. They just said, you know what? It's just hopeless. I knew a man who just very, very overweight. He'd been on every diet that there was, and he always ended up off the wagon, eating poorly, putting on all the weight back. Finally, he just stopped trying, said, when I get to heaven, I'll finally have a different body. Now you ask him, how powerful is your God? Oh, all powerful. But even that all-powerful God can't give me victory over what I eat. And I go around with Christian after Christian and say, and what have you given up on? Who have you given up on? You just tell me what you gave up on, and I'll know how big your God is. Maybe it's in your own life. Some areas in your life you tried to be better at praying. You tried for a while to get up in the morning and spend quality time with God, but you got tired and you quit. And now you just given up. So I'm just never going to be good at prayer. You mean even Almighty God is not powerful enough to help teach you how to pray? What have you given up on? You see, I think these disciples just gave up. And you know what I wish had happened? I wish that when Jesus returned to the village, that Andrew came running up to Jesus. And, Jesus, I'm so glad you got back here. Listen, we got a really tough case here. A little boy, we've never seen a demon like what he's got. But Thomas and Matthew are with him right now. They're comforting the dad. We told the dad, don't go anywhere, because before this day's done, we're going to get you set free. But that's not what happens when the man comes back, is it? When Jesus comes back, who tells the man, or tells Jesus about the problem? The Father does. He runs up to Jesus, tells him the story, and says, I begged your disciples to set him free, but they could not. Well, where's the disciples? What are they doing? I mean, we don't know. The Bible only can speculate. But I sort of get the impression they were packing their bags. They were ready to move on. You know, I can just imagine them thinking, well, no wonder Jesus didn't take us up on the mountain with him. We can't even set a little boy free. This is embarrassing. Let's just move on. Maybe tomorrow will be a better day. I can imagine all the disciples saying, why? It's not like I haven't done this before. I've cast out lots of evil spirits before. This was just a really tough case. Maybe this boy didn't really want to get set free. Maybe there was sin in the father's life. Who knows? But it just didn't work today. But tomorrow will be a better day. Let's move on. Maybe the next village will have better success. And then Jesus comes in, and I just get the impression Jesus is looking at his disciples and saying, so you were just going to leave town? And he's looking, and there's the little boy on the ground in the bondage of an evil spirit. And Jesus is like, so you were just going to leave him there? You were going to give up on that little boy? Oh, faithless and perverse generation. I think he's looking at his own people and saying, you can't give up on people. You can't just move on when you hit a tough case. If it's too hard for you, then grow. Grow in your faith. Grow in your prayer. But don't just walk away and quit. When you quit, when you give up on someone, you've just given up on someone's child. Jesus said, I don't want my people walking away, saying it's too hard. It's too difficult. If it's too hard for you now, then let God grow your faith and your prayer life until it's not too hard anymore. But don't just walk away. And I'll tell you something, I see that. And I've been guilty of that. Can I just tell you, in my own life, I've been a leader all my life. When I was just a little kid, I was leading stuff. When I was in high school, I was the captain of sports teams. I've been a pastor, I've been a seminary president, I lead a nonprofit now. And I don't say this to brag, I'm wired to lead. What I do is lead. It comes naturally to me. And I've had all kinds of problems come in my door as the boss's office. I've had academic deans come in and tell me something. And I knew when I heard it, I was going to have to fire somebody. I've had people come in and tell me news. I realized I'm going to have to raise $500,000. I've had all kinds of problems come in my door where I knew I'm going to have to get a lawyer and I'm going to have to go to court and defend our institution. All kinds of problems have come in my door. I've never had a problem come in my door that I thought to myself, it's hopeless. I don't know what to do. I've always felt like, well, we'll get this solved. We'll figure this out. We'll do whatever it takes. The only time I've had problems face me that overwhelmed me, that were too big for me, was not at my workplace. It was in my home. And I remember I was at a seminary one day, being the president. I was meeting with my leadership team, was preparing to build a multi-million-dollar building and do a bunch of different things. And the phone rings. It's my wife. She said, Daniel has come home from school. Daniel's my middle child. He was about 15 at the time. He had some health issues. He had some struggles he was going through. But he just broke that day. And he just left school, came home, and said, I'm not going back to school. I'm done with school. He's 15 years old. Here I am running a graduate school, and my son is dropping out of school, saying I'm never going back. And my first thought was, oh, Lisa, can you just take care of this? Like, I'm doing all these important things at work. I don't have time to come home and convince a 15-year-old he can't quit school. She said, I've said everything I can say. He needs his dad to come home. So I left work, drove home. What do you tell a 15-year-old that this has decided he's not going to go to school anymore? So I went into the room, and by the way, he always had problems with school. When he was 6 years old, he ran away from school. He decided he'd rather be home than school, so he ran away. We had issues then. It's tough when you think your child is going to be the next Einstein, and then you discover that actually he's on the school's most wanted list. So now at 15, he's really discouraged, and so I go home, knock on the door, go in his room. As soon as I see him, we had a picture in the PowerPoint of him in his very bleary-eyed, defiant, disheveled state, but there he is on his bed. He just looks totally forlorn. He's given up, and he's stubbornly determined nothing is going to change his mind. He will never go back to that school. And so I thought, well, what do I do? Well, I'm a leader. I've had lots of leadership issues before. It's always worked out. So I'll just pull out my leadership bag of tricks, and I'll just do whatever it takes to get this boy to do the right thing. So I thought, I'll just charm him. Lots of times I've come into really tense situations where two sides were really upset, and I sat down in the room, and I just brought them together. I diffused the tension and let them know it was okay. So I walk in and say, Daniel, I understand you're really having a hard day today. Hey, it's all right. Listen, I've had those too. We can work it out, though. There's no reason to be upset. But he knows what I'm trying to do, and he's just steeling himself, and just basically saying, that's not going to work, Dad. I'm on to you. You're not going to talk me out of this. He just said, I'm not going back. So I thought, well, I'll turn on my problem-solving skills. That always works. That's what I do. I solve problems. I'm a leader. So I said, well, Daniel, I know you've got a problem at school, but listen, that's what I do. I mean, every day at work, I solve problems. We can certainly solve your problem. Let's put it on the table, and we'll work it out. We'll find a solution. But he thinks I see him as a problem. He doesn't want me to solve him. And he's like, Dad, it's way too complex. I don't want any of your simple answers. It goes a lot deeper than what I know you're going to deal with. So finally, I thought, well, let him consider the ramifications of dropping out of school at 15. And I wanted him to know that it did not entail him living at our house, playing Nintendo in the basement and eating nachos every day. Like, that's not going to be your future. If you drop out of school, you won't be at our house. You'll be out there earning a living, some hard job. And he didn't care. Whatever it's going to be, he's not going back to school. Finally, I've used every skill that has worked for me at work and other times in my life and made me successful. I finally just shamelessly try to bribe him. It's like, Daniel, how much do I have to pay you to get you back in school? What's your price? I didn't want to walk out the door and face my wife and realize I failed. He couldn't be bought. No amount of money was going to get him back in school. finally, I just resorted to the one trump card that fathers can always go back to if nothing else works. I said, well, you are going back to school because I'm your father, and I said you're going back to school. And I walked out the door, closed the door, walked around the corner to my bedroom. And I remember going into my bedroom, leaning up against the wall in my bedroom, and realizing that was the worst display of parenting I think I've ever done in my life. I did everything that's ever worked for me before, and nothing was working with my son. And I remember just thinking, if I can't get this right, if I fail at this, it's going to cost me my own son. And I realized I can't afford not to get this right. Even though I've got nothing else, I don't know anything else to do. And I cried out to God. Now, I had said prayers for my son before. There's a difference between saying a prayer and crying out to God. I started crying out to God this time. I just cried out and said, God, what does that boy need? What does he need? And the problem with asking God a question is you have to be prepared for his answer. And what I sense God saying is he needs a different father. Because the father he has right now is failing. And if you just keep fathering him the way you have been, you're just going to get more of a disaster on your hands. And I realized right then I had one of two choices. Either I could give up on my own son, or I could say, then God, do whatever you have to do in me. Grow me, change how I father, do whatever you have to do, but help me with that son. And my first son has my temperament, takes after me. So my oldest son, I'm an oldest son, my oldest son and I had a lot in common. It was kind of easy raising that child. You know, that's the problem when your first child is fairly easy to raise. You make the mistake of thinking it's because you're a good parent. And then God gives you a second child who's nothing like the first child. And you realize you've gone completely brain dead between the first child and the second child. That's what happened to me. My first child was not that difficult. The second one, total opposite in every way. And everything that had worked with me on my first child just made matters worse with my second child. And I'm bewildered. All my success is worthless to me. Until I realized the only place I could turn was to the Father in heaven, who knows how to father every human being on the planet. And so I just cried out to God. And God just, there's a longer story to that, but I basically took everything that had worked with my first child, put it aside, and said, God, teach me how to be a dad all over again. Now, you know, I hear a lot of dads at times will say this. They'll say, I've got this one child that just I can't seem to figure out, I can't relate to. And they'll say, but they'll make it sound like it's the child's problem. They just have to know what I'm like. They have to know I've always been this way. They're going to have to adjust it. God said, no, don't ask the struggling child to make all the adjustments. You're the adult. You're the Christian leader. You make the adjustment. Help this child get set free. And so I just began to make the changes. And I parented him like I'd never parented before. Everything was different. And can I just say this? By God's grace, just over a month from now, that child, I'll be in Louisville, Kentucky, and watch that boy walk across the stage and be given a PhD in apologetics. And I remember just saying, God, by the way, when I got that phone call saying, Dad, you've got twins coming today to make your grandfather, it was that son that called me. And as I'm racing to the hospital that day, I'm thinking to myself, if God hadn't changed me, if God hadn't grown me to be the father that boy needed, then when he had those twin boys, I would have been the last person he wanted to be at the hospital. And it would have cost me, would have cost my family an awesome price if I had not been willing to grow. And I'm so grateful that in that bedroom, God just said, roll up your sleeves. Let me make you the man your son needs you to be. Now I've got his grandsons. And I thought I'd finally arrived, but now I've got his grandsons, and God's saying, roll up your sleeves again, because those little boys in the world they're growing up in are going to need a man of God that's bigger than the one you are right now. And so I'm growing again. I pray that whatever it is you're facing in your life, you don't give up. You don't quit. you don't get discouraged. Because there's no person in this room that God cannot take where you are right now and move you to where he wants you to be, if you're willing to let him do it. If you're humble enough to admit you need him to help you to do it. I know a lot of dads. You know, it's sad to me. I know dads whose kids are addicted to drugs. I know dads whose kids won't even speak to them. But those same dads would be embarrassed to even ask their church family to pray for their family. They'll just say it's our business. It's my own business. I'll tell you what, when my kids were struggling, I would have gotten on the rooftop and cried out for help. I wouldn't have, you know what we do? We let our pride keep us from growing, especially men. Men just say, I don't want people to know that I'm failing as a dad. I don't want people to know that my son is struggling. So I'll just kind of just see, hopefully things will turn around. And it doesn't turn around. And then our pride has just cost our kids their future and their walk with God. I just made a commitment early on. I was never going to let my pride cost my kids. I'd humble myself. I'd ask for help. I'd seek advice. I'd get the whole church praying. If that's what I tell you what, when all three of my kids at various times had moments of struggle. And I would go into my church family and I'd find whoever I thought could help one of my kids. And I just asked them, would you be one? My older son at one point got to a point where he just didn't really want to hear any more of my advice. But I really felt he needed some counsel. So I went out and I found the coolest young adult in the whole church. My son thought he was the coolest human being on the planet. This guy was just oozed cool. Like he met his wife in the Himalayan mountains. Like he was a hockey player, a very good hockey player, which my son admired in Canada. My son's a drummer. This guy was probably the only drummer better than my son. My son just thought the guy was just awesome. And I went to this young man, but he didn't even have kids of his own yet. He's like 23 years old. And I said, look, I know you know my son Mike. I said, he needs someone to speak in his life right now, and he doesn't really want that person to be me. So listen, if you just have any available time, would you just spend a little time with my son? I said, if you take him out for a hamburger, I'll pay anything it costs you. You ever take my son out to eat, just give me the bill. I'll cover it. It shouldn't cost you to help me out with my son. But if you'll help my son, I'll be forever grateful. Next week, my son comes home. Dad, you'll never guess what happened. Craig asked me to hang out at his house on Friday night. We're going to be jamming on the drums. We're going to be doing this. And I'm like, oh, that guy, I really like him. He's a nice young man. And Craig's not telling my son anything I haven't been telling him. He's listening to Craig. You know, the funny thing is, years later, Craig started a family of his own. He emailed me and said, you know what? My wife and I are trying to figure what kind of parents we want to be like. We decided we want to be just like you and your wife. I wrote back and said, why would you want to be like me? I mean, I had to ask someone who didn't even have kids to help me out raise one of mine. He said, yeah, but I just so admire someone that was willing to do anything he had to do to help out his kid. That's the kind of parents we want to be. And so I want to just encourage you. I just suspect that probably if we went around the room and just asked each person, where's that hard spot in your life? Where's the point of struggle right now? What is defeating you right now? What have you been tempted to quit, to give up on? I just want you to know, just like Jesus did, he just turned to those disciples and said, you can't stay here. You can't quit now. There's too much at stake for God's people to quit or to give up. Let me just share one just kind of final story. My dad is the greatest man of God that I know. And he's not perfect by any means. I could tell you lots of shortcomings in my dad. But he was just a person that was just committed to never stay where he was, to just keep going further with God. And over the years, my dad's just an ordinary Canadian. He's very introverted. He's very shy. And to be real honest with you, I mean, I've trained people in seminary to be pastors. My dad, I would say, has ordinary skills. Probably he's an ordinary preacher, less than ordinary administrator. He just has an extraordinary hunger for God. That's the one area where he's extraordinary. And so he has been invited to the White House. I have a picture I was going to show you of my dad in the White House. I was with him at the East Room of the White House in 2006. and George Bush was the president. And my dad's on this little platform, and he had just prayed for the whole nation. And as he's about to go down the platform, George Bush is coming up the platform, the president. And he reaches up and he takes my dad by the hand, shakes my dad's hand. I've got a picture of that. I was in the room. I've got a picture of the president reaching up and shaking my dad by the hand. And in fact, I told my dad, I said, I'm going to put a plaque on this picture saying, Dad, extending altar call at the White House. And there's George Bush reaching up to take my dad by the hand. People have flown all around the world to sit down and seek counsel from my dad. And so in 2001, I wrote a book with my dad called Spiritual Leadership. And so he and I began to travel around teaching leadership around the world. We've actually gone to world leaders. We were in the president's palace in the Philippines, handed her a spiritual leadership book. We've had some amazing stories. And so early on, we were in Miami, Florida. And we're gonna do this conference. And there's 2,500 pastors have come. And none of them have come to hear me. They've all come to hear my dad. My dad is famous. He's met world leaders. He's done all these things. And so I'm just kind of the warm-up act. I just kind of start speaking, and then my dad gets up. And many of these pastors have been pastors much longer than I have been. So they're looking at me and wondering, well, what's he going to tell us we don't already know? I've been pastoring 25 years longer than he has. So I know that. I know that everybody's there to hear my dad. But the last night, on Saturday night, it's the very last session. And before it starts, my dad says, Richard, God's really been speaking through you in this meeting. And he said, I want to change things up. He said, tonight, I'm going to go first, and I'm only going to speak for a little bit. And then I'm going to give you the rest of my time, and I want you to really take some time and really preach what God's put on your heart. And then I want you to give the altar call and ask these pastors to draw near to God. And I said, Dad, that won't work. That's a bad idea. I said, number one, no one has come to hear me. So on a Saturday night, 2,500 pastors, as soon as they realize you're done speaking, they won't even wait to hear what I have to say. They'll just leave. And I said, and furthermore, how do I give an altar call to a bunch of pastors who have been pastors a lot longer than I have been? They won't respect that. They won't respond to that. But my dad said, well, I want you to do it. And what I didn't tell my dad is that my dad is the greatest man of God I know. So how do I preach to people to get right with God when the greatest man of God I know is sitting on the front row? How do I tell them you need to get right with God when the greatest man of God I know is sitting right there in front of me? But my dad insisted. So I preached. Then I gave the altar call. I didn't expect anybody to come. In fact, I see people looking at their watches like, okay, we're about done. We'll be out of here soon. And it's Saturday night. They've got to go home and write a sermon for Sunday morning still. So they're ready to go. And so the first verse is being sung. And 2,500 people. It's a big auditorium. It's a big stage. I'm kind of just looking out. Nobody's really coming forward. I didn't really expect that. And so I'm just kind of, I thought, well, we'll sing 2 verses and we'll wrap it up. We'll go home. And so we're going into the second verse, and they've kind of darkened the lights, and so I'm kind of looking around, and all of a sudden I realize that out of 2,500 people, there's only one person out of 2,500. And over to my right, someone has come, and they've knelt down, they're praying. And at first, I saw some movement to my right. I thought it was actually a janitor just beginning to move the furniture, stack chairs so they could go home. Like, clearly, we're done here. Might as well stack the chairs so we can get out of here. But I looked a little more closely, and I realized there is one person on his knees praying fervently to God. But I do a double take, because that one person is my dad. And I look back, and I realized the only person who came forward to pray is my dad. And so my first thought was, what is he doing at the altar? That's the greatest man of God I know. And I just felt like God spoke back to me and said, well, Richard, that's why he is the greatest man of God you know. Because every time there's an opportunity to draw near to God, he's always the first guy on his knees. Everybody, 2,500 people, all would have said, that's the greatest man of God we know. And he was the only man to say, but God, if you've got more for me, I want to come and get it. Because you can't give to other people what you don't have yourself. And I just saw something happen, because the pastors near the front began to notice that the only person who'd come forward was my dad. And you could just see the spirit of conviction sweeping across those pastors. I could see it in their faces. These pastors suddenly realized, wait a minute, if Henry Blackaby said there's still more of God he needs, what am I doing sitting here in my chair? I better get down there too. And hundreds of pastors began filing out. I saw a pastor lying on his face, just prostrate on the floor, weeping to God because he was so hard-hearted, prideful, and thinking he didn't need to grow some more himself. I saw a pastor in the back. He had come with about 10 of his church members, and he was weeping and apologizing to his church members and saying, just pray for me. I would become the pastor that you need me to be. And revival swept throughout those 2,500 church leaders. And it started when perhaps the godliest man in the whole room said, God, if I'm even just a quarter of an inch away from where I ought to be, I'm coming to get right. And I remember looking at that and saying, God, help me to have that kind of heart. The only reason that you use my dad is not because he's the most eloquent person, eloquent preacher. He's just the hungriest to draw closest to God. And if you'll just keep drawing closer to him and saying, God, just don't let me stay the same person I've been. I've been praying for a long time, but God, I know my prayers could be more powerful than they are. I've been a person of faith, but God, I know that I could move even greater mountains if I just had greater faith. And I guess what God has just taught me is this. When you stop growing, other people suffer. Other people will suffer when you stop growing. So you can't stop. You can't stop. When I looked at those grandsons' faces and thought, I never will let them suffer because I just said, I've been this way for the last 50 years. I'm not going to change now. I'm not going to go tell that to my grandsons. When my grandsons are being bullied in high school for being Christians, and they come to me, I want to be ready to give them a word that holds them fast, makes them know that after hearing from Grandpa, we're holding on to Jesus. I've got to keep growing because it will cost other people if at some point I just say, this is as far as I go with God. There's always another place to go with God. And if there is, I want to get there. So could I just encourage you as we close? We'll have just a final time just to respond, and perhaps even as I've been sharing, the Lord has been reminding you of a person, a situation that you've given up on. Maybe an issue in your own life where you've tried over the years and you've just met regular failure. And tonight you would say, God, I'm not giving up. I'm not going to give up. Help me, God, in my unbelief to grow to a place where I finally have victory in my life over this. And maybe there's a broken relation. Maybe there's a lost person. Maybe it's a brother, a family member that you prayed for years, but you've just even stopped trying in recent years because it never seemed to work. Maybe you just need to take that person and bring them to the altar and say, God, forgive me for giving up on this person. I should have been the last person to give up. I'm the Christian holding, standing in the gap for this person. Forgive me for giving up. Whatever it might be in your life, can I just invite you, if you need to come and just put that person on the altar and say, God, henceforth from this point on, if I'm the only person who still believes, I'm going to keep having faith. And God, would you just grow me, grow my prayer life, grow my witness, grow my walk with you, so you can do more through my life in 2019 than you ever did in 2018. So let me pray with you, and then we'll just take a moment to respond. Lord, thank you for these who faithfully come and heard your word, receive what you have for them. And Lord, I pray even as we would just bring this time to a close in these final moments, that Lord, if there's still an adjustment that some of us need to make in our life, if there's an area in our life that we've struggled to trust you for, Lord, we may have hit the end of ourselves, something that just was too difficult for us, something that just seemed to always defeat us. But God, I pray that tonight you would do to us as you did with your disciples and take them to a deeper place. Help them to have victory, finally, once and for all. And God, just don't leave us where we are. There's so many people counting on us going deeper with you. And so, Lord, forgive us for getting comfortable, settled in, when there was still so much you had for us. So I pray that we'd have a hunger, just like my father did, that every time there's an opportunity to draw closer to you, to receive even more from you, or may we hurry to get to that place so that we can become all that you'd have us to be, so we have more to give to others than we've ever had before. So help us even in these closing moments. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Why don't you just stand with me and